Hello, and welcome back to She Makes It Work with Gabby and Abi. Today, we're talking about bad feedback. What is it and how to deal with it?
I always start off by saying this is my favorite topic. This is not my favorite topic, if I have to be honest. I really hate bad feedback, not just for me, but for other people. And we're going to talk about how to tell the difference between good feedback and bad feedback, and also how to tell the difference between feedback that is critical but helpful and feedback that is just plain crappy. And you can tell when feedback is just plain crappy because you feel bad. I'm just going to leave it at that. You feel really bad when you get it. So first, let's talk about what are the characteristics of good feedback. Good feedback is delivered with thought and care. Good feedback is delivered by a leader or a peer who's interested in helping to genuinely develop you. It doesn't feel like a personal attack. And when someone is giving you good feedback that's actually genuinely helpful, they make sure that you're in a mental and emotional place to be receptive to that feedback. And so a lot of times good feedback starts with, I'd love to give you some feedback. Is this a good time? And
Consent
consent
is important.
Yeah, because then you can opt in, and then you can also get yourself mentally and emotionally prepared for the feedback.
Yeah.
And again, it's delivered with kindness and care, and good feedback is focused on behavior and not something that is, about your character or about who you are as a person. And so that's one of the biggest ways to tell the difference between good feedback and bad feedback is this something where they're focusing on a behavior that I can change? Or is this something where they're making me feel like it's inherent to me? It's a character flaw.
Like a personal attack.
A personal attack.
Yeah.
And we often say no one can make you feel anything. So we'll come back to that in a second. But again, when you're looking at the feedback and you're having a reaction to it, ask yourself, was this given to me in a time where I felt mentally and emotionally ready for it? Did they ask me if this is a good time? Did they really set this up, for my own benefit so that I could really process it? And is it really behavior focused feedback? That's a great other question to ask yourself. And then also, is this actionable feedback? Because good feedback should ask for you to make a change. That's one of the reasons why behavior focus is so important, because they can tell you, hey, this is the behavior that's, not working in some way. Here's how it's not working. And this would be more effective if you did this other thing. That's what good feedback is. And so the reason I'm really highlighting that is because we make a big point on She Makes It Work that just because you might find feedback challenging doesn't mean that it's not good. And so we talk a lot about not being defensive, right? Right? Not being defensive. And sometimes good feedback still might trigger an emotion in you. And you might feel defensive because you might know that's an issue. We've talked about that before, and you're kind of like this, or it's something about yourself that you may not like, and you've never felt previously like you had the power to change it. But good feedback puts the power in your hands because it's telling you can do this thing to change this behavior.
It's actionable.
It's actionable. Yeah. It's something you can work with. It's something you can do. You know what to do. And so one of the characteristics of truly bad feedback is when you don't know what to do with the feedback.
Yeah. Oof.
Right?
That's hitting home.
And that can be very confusing where you don't know what to do with the feedback. So let's talk about critical feedback versus genuinely bad feedback, because critical feedback may engender some emotion in you. It may be triggering for some reasons we just talked about, but bad feedback isn't just triggering. Like I said, it's confusing, and it can leave you doubting and questioning yourself. So when you're getting feedback and you're trying to determine, is this valuable, critical feedback, or is this feedback bad? Let's go back to the questions you can ask yourself. Was the question delivered with the intention of helping you? And is my reaction something that's inside myself that's a sign that I do need to deal with something? Like I'm just going to use an example. If you know you're not great at time management and somebody fusses at you for being late, what happens?
You're going to feel bad.
You feel bad and you get defensive.
Guilty and get defensive, yeah.
And to be clear, sometimes that can feel like a personal attack when it isn't.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what you need to unpack when you're trying to determine, is this critical but fair feedback, or is this genuinely bad feedback?
Yeah. Is it saying something about me I already know that I'm feeling shame around, and that's the bad feeling, versus this is not true and this isn't authentic to me, And that's how it feels bad.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that takes a little bit to unpack, is the difference between, is this triggering like a shame reaction and that's where my defensiveness is coming in, or is this genuinely just horrific feedback, right? So let's hone in on what to do with that so you can really process that. We're going to help you figure out how to process that difference, right? Because that's what we do, is we process.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so I have two main tips for processing. One is to find a trusted mentor or coach. Like, you don't want to just ask your friends, because if your friends are anything like a lot of our friends, they're just going to hype you up. They're going to be like, that sucked. That was so unfair.
Screw that guy.
Yeah. And really, if you're genuinely focused on developing yourself and improving, which I think most of our audience is, then what you really want is someone to help you process it in a way that's kind of fair and balanced. Like, is there a grain of truth to this?
Right.
Right? That's what you need to find out. So I'd say that's my first tip, is find someone who's trusted, who you know can give you a little bit more insight into that feedback and help you either get the nugget of truth that's buried under maybe poor delivery for some reason, or buried under your shame, and get that nugget out. Is find someone trusted who can really talk through it with you. And you can tell if the person's just hyping you up. And it's okay to tell your friend or mentor or coach, I really do want to know if there's something there.
Yeah.
I want to know if there's something there. That's a great question to ask.
It is, definitely. I know I've sat with that a lot. I've gotten lots of different feedback over the years, and I've had to sit with it and kind of unpack of like, okay, where's the nugget of truth in here? Just like you said. And if that's true, I love playing what I call this game with myself, is like, if that's true, what else has to be true? So if it is true that I'm late, and then that may mean that I'm bad at time management, but that means that's an actionable thing that I can work on. I can watch our time management episode and figure out little tips and tricks to not be late. And so I've noticed when I have that kind of shame feeling, I want to push it away. I'm like, no, that's not true. But then really taking the time to say, okay, am I in my feelings about this? Right. And really going from there. And once you acknowledge that, yeah, that kind of that hurt my ego a little bit, then you can kind of break away from that ego and get to the truth and the heart of the issue.
That's right. I'd say my second tip related to how to process that is to journal about it. And Abby and I both use journaling as a very effective tool in our professional and personal lives, right? And so with journaling, when I say journal about it, I want you to do two things. One is sit down and try and write down what they said as factually as possible. Because what happens is, as soon as you have that emotional reaction, you start ascribing things to the other person.
Yeah.
Right. And so here I'm saying, hey, was it delivered with good intent? Were they honestly trying to help and develop you? Well, unfortunately, when you're having like a strong shame reaction, a lot of times you're ascribing intention to them that may not actually be there.
Right.
Right.
You're projecting.
You're projecting. So you can't actually see that clearly. But what really helps see it clearly is again, asking a trusted person who can help you kind of get to the bottom of it. But B, journal about it. Write down factually what they said, not what you felt about what they said, but what did they actually say? Record that as quickly as possible before your brain can start putting more and more things on it.
Spin on it. Yeah.
Right? Because that's what happens. We're human. It's okay. And then next to that, that's where I want you to actually start doing the processing. So a great way to process those I statements is to put them in your journal. I feel like this because why? And that's where you need to do some self-exploration, because it's human nature when someone tells us something we don't like, we start projecting onto them, but we also start making it about them. And that's where you need to like catch yourself and be like, oh my gosh, I'm making up a story about them when really I need to understand my own story. And that's where your energy should be spent, is understanding yourself, not trying to, again, make up reasons why they might be telling you this, but instead, where's my reaction coming from?
Yeah, and it's easier to put it on somebody else, right? It's like easier. Oh, that person's a jerk, or they don't understand me. It is easier than taking the time to explore and go deep in your own stuff. Like it is, and most people don't do that, and that's how you get better, and that's how you rise above everyone around you, is because you take that time and you dig deep and you figure out you work on your own stuff, right? Like that's so important.
It's so important to work on your stuff. So that's where that second thing is going in, is processing your own feelings through journaling, right?
Yeah.
Like even if your mentor is telling you there's something there, there's probably something there you should look at, you still need to do this work of journaling it out to help process your own emotions and your own thoughts about it and separate the emotions from your thoughts, because you have to be able to exist in two states simultaneously. One is a feeling person and one is a thinking person,
Mm.
because the thinking person wants to grow, whereas the feeling person wants to react.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I know when I've had bigger emotions to seemingly innocuous feedback, that it's not about that thing. Actually, it's triggering something a little deeper of hurt from long time ago. I like to say if it's hysterical, it's historical. And so I know when I've had big feelings about feedback and I'm like, that is so untrue. And how could they say that? That it's not about the thing. I
Mm-hmm.
always like to say too, is like, if you're really, really upset, it's not about the thing. It's about something else.
There's a meme because of all the Reddit posts. And anyway, it's really funny. It's the meme, the Iranian yogurt is not the issue. Have you seen that?
No.
Oh my gosh. It's really, really funny because there was this like relationship issue and this couple like blew up and they were fighting about yogurt or something. And everyone's like, the yogurt's not the
Not the
issue. It's not
issue.
the issue. And
It's a
so
catalyst, but not the
yeah,
issue.
I love that
Mhm.
meme where it's like, yeah, that's what you're seeing, but that's not what the real issue is.
Exactly.
And I'm going to have to say, the bigger your emotional response to bad feedback, the more that's your signal that there is something going on that you
Mhm.
can change and can control. And so, even though I described what good feedback looks like, I don't want people to fall into the trap of being critical about the feedback they're being given and saying, well, they didn't deliver it correctly, so I don't have to listen to it.
Ooh,
That's an easy trap to fall into,
it's an
right?
easy cop out.
It's an
Yeah.
easy cop out. But when you're really focused on professional development and self development, you don't let that crap get in your way. You don't let all that noise in your head get in your way. You focus on, what can I get out of this?
Mhm.
So once you're done journaling about your emotional and then kind of your intellectual processing, you need to get to a point where you've set the emotions aside and you ask yourself, what can I learn from this? What can I take away from this? Is it the thing they said on the surface, or they're human too? Did they just deliver the message poorly and there's something in there I need to listen to?
Mhm.
I'm going to give an example of that
Okay.
really quick. It's
Yeah.
an easy example. I had somebody at work who is a senior leader who I very much respected and admired. She and I, however, had a very complicated past. We had our ups and downs, but I still respected her. And so she gave me feedback one time that just, it didn't have like a huge emotional reaction, but there was a little bit of an emotional reaction in me. And so the example is, I was working with a peer of mine and he was doing something that negatively impacted the team, and he was known for doing this. And so I gave him feedback about that. Like I prepped and I sat down and I was like, hey, so and so, when you do this, I've noticed that the team feels like this. It would be more helpful for the team if in these situations you could handle it this other way. And he was not receptive to the feedback. And he just was like, nah, you know what I mean? Like,
Nah. Okay.
I mean, it's not literally what he said, but figuratively, it was kind of like pass. So he wasn't receptive to the feedback and he reported directly to this leader at the time. And so I think I was telling her about it, or I was maybe asking her for advice. I don't know how it came up, but we're talking about it. And she basically said, Gabby, you give up too easy.
Oh. Whoa. Whoa. We talked about tenacity last episode. So, woo. How did that land?
I was like, what? Like, I was honestly just confused. I was confused because I was like, that does not sound like me.
It doesn't.
Right. And that's where I started to think, is this feedback for me? Because that doesn't sound like me in terms of how I think about myself or in terms of how other people see me. Doesn't mean it's not possible. But I was like, what? And I was like, what do you mean? And she told me, she's like, Gabby, if you're coaching these other people and they're not taking that coaching or they're not taking that feedback, what do you do? And I said, well, I keep working with them on it. And she's like, well, what's the difference? And I'm like, the difference is they're more junior to me and I'm responsible for them. And this person is my peer. And I don't see myself as being responsible for their growth and development.
Fair.
Like, I just don't see that as my role.
Fair.
And she, however, was very persistent about this feedback in this conversation, not aggressively, not inappropriately, like, again, no complaints. It's just, I wasn't getting it. And she's like, Gabby, you know, you should be as equally, and I mean, let me clarify. He was on my project team. So in a way I was responsible for him.
Mm.
But in the model at the company I worked at, on the project team, you give the feedback, but the people manager is still responsible for their development. Meaning, if you, as the project leader, have given them the feedback and they're not able to address it, that's where the people manager comes in and they support giving the feedback and they're responsible for that person's career development. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there's a boundary there.
Mm-hmm.
And the backstory here is that I had just spent years working on my professional boundaries because I had felt responsible for everyone and everything.
Mm.
And so I had just gotten to a point in my development where I'd started to set that down, where I'd realized, no, this is where my responsibility ends. And I was kind of proud of myself, to be honest. So that was the second part of why it just didn't land right with me, is I'm like, hey, I've worked really hard to develop this boundary. I'm not actually responsible for this other person. And I'm frankly proud of myself for not taking responsibility for somebody else's behavior.
It's a big win when you formally feel responsible for everyone. That setting that down, that's actually a huge win.
It's huge,
so yeah, I would
right?
have been proud of that too.
Yeah. And so it was really interesting. I would say I revisited this feedback for maybe up to 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, not in a bad way, but every once in a while I would just take it out of its drawer and I would mull over it because I knew there was something there for me.
Mm.
It wasn't what was on the surface. It wasn't what she said. Does that make sense? And so, and I had like floated it by other people and they were like, shrug, you know, but again, I very much respect this person. I trusted that she was saying this for my benefit.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't agree with her, but I'm like, there's got to be something there. So after about 1.5, maybe 2 years of, again, every few months taking this out of the drawer, inspecting it and putting it back in the drawer, I finally realized what she was getting at.
Oh.
There was a second part of what she said, and this is what happens with feedback. This is why I'm saying write it down word for word what they actually said, because your brain is going to focus on the part you're reacting to.
Oh, so good. Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to ignore some of the other things it said because you're so focused on the part that got the reaction. Mm-hmm. And in my case, the reaction wasn't for me that strong. We all know I could be a little, but at that time, it was more just like, that doesn't feel like me. I was just confused. But again, I can be intense about my confusion. I got to the point where I was like, wait, there was a second part of what she said when I was questioning her. And that second part was, what if you were on XYZ account and you had to deal with account manager with a huge personality? What would you do? And I said, well, hopefully you care about me enough that you would never make me work on that account because that account manager is famously difficult to work with, right? So I was having a little fun with it and joking about it. But after a while, I finally realized that was actually the point. That's what she was trying to help me with, was she wanted to make sure I wasn't non-confrontational. And I'm, again, famously not afraid of confrontation, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take work. And it doesn't mean it doesn't take courage. And that doesn't mean that there's never going to be in a situation where I'm confronted with a difficult leader and not facing that. Right? Does that make sense? Because with this guy who is my peer, he had a difficult personality. And again, I'd worked with him pretty closely and I felt like I was right. If he's not receptive to the feedback, I can't change him. And that's not my job, was really my perspective. And I'm also kind of pragmatic where I'm like, hey, okay, then I'm not going to waste my time. Like, I'm very pragmatic. But she really wanted to make sure that I could sit with the big dogs. That was really what her concern was. And so again, it really was coming from a place of wanting to develop me as a leader, looking out for my longer term career. And I'm not judging her that she didn't articulate it in a way that didn't land with me. She articulated it the best way she could, and she was coming from a good place. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't bad feedback just because I didn't get it at first.
Oh, okay.
Just because you don't get it. Yeah, it was a slow burn. And again, that's kind of my point here, is that even in feedback where you're kind of like question mark, and especially feedback where you're like emotional reaction, you really need to take the time to find the nugget of truth in there, because that's the whole point of a blind spot, is that we're blind to it.
Yeah, we didn't see it. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we want to protect our blind spots. And one of the things I'm really proud of you about is you're so open to hearing about your blind spots. We all have them. Yeah. And I love that about you, is that when you hear about a blind spot, you're like, oh my gosh, let me dig into that.
Yeah.
Let me dig into that.
Because as we mentioned before, other people can see them and just not me. And when I've gotten really blind spot feedback, we'll say, that was surprising. It's at first it's like, whoa, okay, maybe a little ouch, right? But it's like, okay, that's where I go. If that is true, then what else has to be true? Okay, if this is true, then that means, and I go into problem solving mode, really. And for me, that's how I take the ego out of it, is because I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying, so if this is true, what else has to be true? And again, that's how I take my ego out of it, because I'm not saying it has to be true. I'm not saying it is true. I'm saying, if this is true, what else has to be true? And that's how I kind of try on different mindsets, right? And then I can kind of live in that feedback of, if this is true, then what else has to be true? Oh, okay. Then it means that I also am doing those things over here. I have other blind spots that I'm now able to see because I can now see this original blind spot, right? And so that for me is, I definitely want to dig in, because again, everybody can already see it except me. And so I don't want to be tardy to the party, right? So I want to get in there and figure out, like, how can I shore this up as quickly as possible and move on? Because I've posted on LinkedIn about, we can only be as self-aware as we are at any given time, right? But when someone brings you really a gift like that, that points out a blind spot, now you can see more and you can be more self-aware. And that's for me the goal. And that is, true, that the more self-aware a leader is, the better they are. So the more you can find your blind spots, whether they're given to you or you can find them yourself, like, the better we all are. Right?
Yeah, I love that, because someone helping you with your self-awareness is giving you a gift. They're
Yeah.
helping you be a better leader.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference between like difficult and challenging feedback and bad feedback, is that difficult feedback, you're still feeling like, I want to learn about that about myself. I want to understand and process that and apply the lesson that's in there. And in the example I just gave, that was the same thing. I was like, I don't get it, but I genuinely knew I respect this woman. I genuinely know that even though we've had our ups and downs, she was trying to help me. Why else would she be spending her time talking to me? You know what I mean? And it would have been so easy to be like, she just doesn't get me. That's an easy trap to fall into.
Cop
And
out.
there was that voice. There was, but I'm like, no, I just quieted that voice. I'm like, what can I do with that? But now let's talk about actual bad feedback, because actual bad feedback can be really damaging.
Yes, I know this one a little too well.
Yeah. So I want you to tell your story, and I want you to talk about the impact of the bad feedback as well.
Whew, okay. So in a previous role, I had a boss that gave me some feedback that really messed with my head. Going back, I've been a single mom, and it's soon after I divorced, my ex-husband had a brain injury, a traumatic brain injury. And so I had to, not only single mom, but deal with that and lots of struggles there. And so I became the pillar of, my daughter and my family. So pretty self-reliant. And so I had this boss that was getting vision from the directly from the leaders of the company. And I was asking a lot of questions about that, because that's the only way I could get the vision. And the feedback that I got was that I needed to read a book called On Self-Reliance. And that really messed with my head. Having come from where I just said I came from, having come from this, figure it all out, all the pressures on my shoulders, carrying this, all of these traumatic things that were going on, having come from that. And now I'm, at a high level position, and to have someone tell me to read a book called On Self-Reliance, it's implying that I wasn't self-reliant. That really felt like a gut punch. It really messed with my head, because I was like, wait, what? and again, trying to take that feedback and find the nugget of truth in it, I'm like, how can this be true? And I sat with that for a very, very long time. And come to find out, I think that this person was actually purposefully gaslighting me. I don't know that. I don't want to assume that. However, after sitting with this for so long, that's the only conclusion I can really come to.
What was the impact of that? Like, you're saying it sent you a headspin, but like, what was the real impact to you?
It affected my self-esteem. I was like, do I even know what I'm doing? Like, I thought I did, and I was really effective. And then it made me less effective at work, because I was so in my head about it. And I started again to spin, and just when I would make a decision and be like, this is what we need to do, then I would second guess it, because I'm like, well, this is how I've shown up before, but is that right now? And I'm trying to fit into this, trying to align with this feedback that really was was off target feedback. And it really had a detriment to my confidence, my self-esteem. Whether or not that was the point, I don't know, but that's the impact it had. And that not only translated at work though. I took that home. I started taking that home, and I'm like questioning all of my decisions, because I'm
Like,
like,
am I not as self-reliant as I thought I was?
exactly.
Yes.
Am I not as self-reliant as I thought I was? However, I've built this entire life from scratch. How could I not be? Right. And so that's when, my mindset game is pretty strong. And I really, I like to think I clawed my way back from that feedback of like, no, I decided, no, that doesn't feel right. I'm not going to take that on. I'm not going to let that feedback stay. I am self-reliant. Just look around. And so that's when I decided, and I feel like I overcame that feedback. And then that's my success story from this bad feedback, was look what I did with it.
Yeah, you did overcome it. And I do want to say, but it still hurt, because
It
the
did.
first time you told me about it, I could see that it was still in there hurting you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the danger of bad feedback. And that's actually how you know feedback is truly bad, is that it makes you question yourself and it makes you doubt yourself. And what you never want is self-doubt, because we're supposed to be helping each other grow and lifting each other up. And no one can grow if their self-esteem and self-confidence is damaged. And frankly, if their sense of themselves is damaged, if they're questioning their own identity, that's really damaging. And that's where I'm like, that's bad feedback. And so let's go back to that conversation. Let's unpack that a little bit. Because the first thing I want to say is, you guys did not have that trusted relationship going into that conversation where he could give you feedback that was, in my opinion, sensitive. That is, like, if he really thought that needed to be delivered sensitively and from someone with a more trusted relationship.
Yeah.
I don't think you guys had the relationship for that conversation.
We did not.
Right. And for a reason, apparently.
Yeah.
Right. And then I don't know if he, asked you, are you open to feedback right now? Like, did he set it up well?
Nope.
And that's where I'm like, hey, don't be judgy of how someone gives the feedback. But if they're not hitting any mark of good feedback, then you do kind of have to question their intention going into it, or their ability to deliver effective feedback, to be honest. But also, that's not behavioral feedback. What he needed to do to make it effective feedback was instead talk to you about the behavior.
Yeah.
Right? Not about the behaviors coming from a lack of self-reliance, but hey, I know you've got these questions. I've given you all the information I have. I'd love to see what you can take away and do with that.
Yeah, there was
that
no
would have been a
action.
great conversation.
There was no direction. It was just, here's this like vague verbal assault almost, and go deal with it.
It wasn't behavioral, and frankly, it wasn't actionable, because you're going to go read this book on self-reliance, but what does he want to see you do differently at work?
Yeah, what's the takeaway?
What's the changed behavior he wants to see? Just be more self-reliant. That's a quality. That's not a behavior. So that is something where we didn't have this conversation when it happened, obviously, because we would have really dug into that quite a bit. Because I also think, depending on who that person is, in this case, it was your boss at the time. If it's your boss giving you bad feedback, I 100% want you to follow up on that conversation, right? And in this case, obviously, you don't work there anymore, and thank goodness this is of the past, as we would say, right? Yes. But I would suggest that if you, the viewer, are in this situation and someone's giving you this bad feedback, what's the relationship? If this is, frankly, a temporary relationship, I would just be like, okay, thanks, bygones, and just whatever with it, right? But if it's somebody where you expect to have a long-term relationship with them, or they're your boss, they're responsible and accountable for your development, and also you need them to champion you, I would 100% go back and say, I took that away, and I would actually love to reframe this conversation, because I'm hearing about the self-reliance, and that's just not resonating with me. And so I'd love to hear more about what prompted you. What are you seeing in me that's prompting you to go to self-reliance? Because I'd love to actually like anchor this back to being a little bit more behavioral, because I feel like that's a little easier for me to process and control. I can control my behavior. Right. And so you have power as the recipient of feedback. And that's the other thing I want to iterate, is that you can take the power back in your hands, right? Like, you are empowered to turn that feedback into a conversation that's a little bit different than the conversation they're trying to have with you.
Yeah. And that's a really good point too, because sometimes I know in the past when I've gotten feedback, it's just like, okay, I'm going to sit with that. And then I just have to sort through it on my own and not make it a conversation. And I've got to take this away and just, work on it, but not have a conversation about it. And if I'm unclear, well, I can't ask clarifying questions about it, and I can't revisit that conversation. So almost that permission to go revisit a conversation is, I think, really important.
Yeah. And in most cases, the other person genuinely has positive intent.
Yeah.
And so it's so important to ascribe positive intent, even when it's bad feedback, because that's actually part of what's keeping you from going back and having a follow-up conversation is you start thinking they're trying to do something to me, and then you don't go back and follow up. In this case, I'm not going to comment on what his intention was, but I'm less inclined to ascribe positive intent when he went about everything so wrongly. But even in that case, if it were me, you bet he'd be having another conversation with me about that. Like he would be hearing from me about that if he were giving me that feedback. Just that it doesn't land well with me. And frankly, as an independent woman and a single professional mother, I'm offended that that's where you went. I would 100% say that to him. 100%. You as well, I don't necessarily want to get into that, but you as a man are going to tell me as an independent, single woman, professional, you're going to tell me I'm not self-reliant? Like, where does that come from? Like, where does it in you that that's where you went to?
Yeah.
It's okay to do that. You can challenge people. So I think that that is really important, that whether the feedback is bad or difficult, it's really important to see yourself as in control of how you address that feedback.
Yeah.
You're in control of how you process it, and you're in control of what you do about it, including having follow-up conversations. And I'm just going to say, having been on the other side of the table, there have been times where I've given feedback that didn't land well, and I didn't ever hear about it from that person. I always heard it from other people. And that's a disappointment because my intention is genuinely always good. And since I'm really trying to help that person, if they're struggling to process that feedback, I would love for them to come back to me. So again, as that leader who sometimes said things that didn't land the way I wanted them to, I would love for that person to come back and say, Gabby, I know you're trying to help me. I don't get it. Or I'm upset about it, and help me help you, right? I want to help you work through that. And so I think it's really rare that you're going to encounter somebody who wouldn't be receptive to that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so for anybody who's struggling with bad feedback, again, if you're getting to the point where you're doubting yourself, then I would say definitely sit down and reframe it and put yourself in the power seat. Because a lot of times what happens is we catastrophize as well. If we're getting bad feedback that we don't like and we're like, holy crap, that's going to ruin my reputation. That's what we think all the time. What you don't want to do is make a bigger deal out of it in that situation, right? Like, so just really think about like, if it's landing well and if it's not landing well and you're starting to spiral, ask yourself, why am I spiraling? What am I worried about? Because now you're telling yourself a story about the future. And I'm here to tell you that just because you got some challenging feedback or genuinely bad feedback, it doesn't necessarily have to ruin your brand or your reputation. And it's okay. Like, it's just a blip on the radar. And I know that branding yourself at work is important, but what you want to do is replace that with good stories. So you just don't let that story take hold, and you replace it with good stories. And you kind of maybe lean on your network a little bit to help you with that too. So I do want to say that because part of dealing with bad feedback is making sure it doesn't damage your reputation at work. And again, one of the best ways to make sure it does not damage your reputation at work is to make sure that there's more good stories out there than there are this one, and that you don't make this bad feedback a bigger conversation than it is, right?
Yeah.
And what that means is don't go talk to 20 people about it, because what you're actually doing is you're like now cementing that as your brand.
Socializing your,
and you're making yourself
your
a
worst
complainer,
moment. Yeah.
right? And so you're making yourself look even worse.
Yeah.
Do not do that. Like, if this is genuinely like just completely not applicable to you, just sweep it under the rug and get some better stories out there. That's one of my biggest tips for dealing with bad feedback is do your internal processing. Don't let it impact your self-worth. And if you're spiraling about, well, what does this mean for my career? Take control of that too. You are in control at all times. And you can make sure that you've just got more better stories and that nobody listens to this one.
I love that.
Yep. All right. So I hope that was helpful.
It was
right?
helpful for me. I got to unpack some stuff.
We did some good
I feel
work
like this is
today.
therapy.
So again, I'm just going to recap the tips on dealing with the bad feedback, which is definitely check in with a mentor and a trusted person to help you process it. Use your journal as a tool, capture the facts of what they said in the feedback, and then do some processing about your emotional and also intellectual reactions there. And then also sit with it a bit, separate out that emotion and look for the nugget of truth. And then if it's still just not resonating or making sense, follow up. You can go back to the person and have a follow-up conversation, right?
Yeah.
And then if it's really making you doubt yourself, if it's impacting your self-esteem and self-confidence, Abby, I want you to say again what you do with that, because I thought that was really helpful.
I changed my mindset and decided that wasn't for me.
I think that's great. Don't let it impact your self-confidence. And then again, if you're worried about your reputation at work, just replace that bad story with good stories and don't amplify the story. Don't feed it. Don't give it more attention than it's worth.
Exactly.
So I hope that was helpful. Thank you again so much. So please, if you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe. It helps so much. And if you have any comments or feedback, please leave it down in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.